Hi, I'm Tommy with SuperSteer, and today we've got a 2021 Sprinter 3500 up on the lift. We're going to be installing a SuperSteer SS701 rear track bar. All right, here we've got our track bar rod. We've got the end of the rod. We've got our jam nut. We've got our rod spacer. We've got our axle clamp plate that one end of the rod will connect to, and we've got our spacer plate that goes opposite side of the axle from the axle clamp plate. And then we have our track bar mounting, which connects up to your frame, to your chassis side. And you might notice we've got two different lengths of bolts. So these are 100 millimeter, these are 90 millimeter. You use either one depending. If these are too long, then you would use the shorter one. So you just have to get it up there and check. It may depend on which style of saddle brackets your coach is equipped with. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so now we're gonna start preparing for installing the rear track bar. As we're starting that, I wanna draw a few things to your attention. So first of all, you may notice this pointer and measuring tape there. That's not standard equipment on a Mercedes Sprinter chassis. We do have that installed here, kind of going along with a separate series of videos where we actually were checking for side shift in the rear axle while we're driving. So that's just there for measuring purposes on the road. And other things to note, we're fortunate enough here to be able to be up on these lifts. If you're do-it-yourself or doing it at home, you may be doing it on the ground. Either way, the important thing to note is that the vehicle's weight must be on the suspension. We want it at normal ride height for this installation. One other thing to note, we did go ahead and remove the spare tire. Not all Sprinters have that, but this one did. By removing it, we gave ourselves a lot more room to work with. Again, if we were doing this on the ground, that would help out a lot. One more thing to note, in this case, we were fortunate enough to have the rear exhaust exit in front of the rear axle. In some cases, it may go over your rear axle and exit the rear. If that is the case, you would likely need exhaust modifications, tailpipe modifications, I should say, in order to install the rear track bar. Again, in this case, we didn't have to do that. So now we are ready to go ahead and start the installation. All right, so our first step is we're gonna go ahead and loosen all 4 of our bolts that hold the rear sway bar to the axle. We're gonna remove the 2 on the passenger side, and we're just gonna loosen the 2 on the driver's side. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm using a 3/4 inch 19 millimeter impact. All right, so we've got our passenger side sway bar mounting bolts removed, and we have our driver's side loose. We've only got these loose, but not all the way out, because we want something to help hold the sway bar in place. We do still have enough give in the bushing that I can pull that back to get the axle bracket in place. Important to note, do not get rid of these bolts when you remove them. We need at least 2 of them. Later on, we're going to use those to attach the upper bracket to where your end links connect on the chassis. So now let's go ahead and get our axle bracket in place. The instructions say that you can either use the 100 millimeter length bolt or the 90 millimeter length bolt if the 90 millimeter length is, or if the 100 millimeter length is too long. Now in this case, we can just compare the bolt that I removed to our new hardware. So you can see our 100 millimeter is longer than the OEM one. The 90 millimeter, however, is shorter. We don't want to use something shorter than our original hardware because we're adding another bracket there. We need to go longer, so we're going to go ahead and use the 100 millimeter length bolts. We're going to go ahead and use our red Loctite on these bolts that was included with the kit. Do just a little dab there, as well as on the jam nut. So on our axle bracket, we make sure that this curved portion is facing that way. If you have it turned the other way, you're going to hit your frame. sure that's getting started there. So there's our first one started. Have to wiggle that bracket a little bit. The top hole is slotted in it, so that allows some adjustment. Make sure that we're getting those engaged. Okay, now that those are started, we're going to go ahead and remove our driver's side. Get our Loctite on there. Just grab one for now along with our spacer plate. This one can turn it either way. All right, those are started. Make sure these are all started before we go ahead and run them down. So we're gonna just go ahead and carefully cinch them down with our impact wrench. Once we run them down snug with this, we'll go ahead and use a torque wrench to tighten them to 80 to 85 foot-pounds. And I'm just going back and forth to make sure it's tightening evenly. All right, don't want to hammer too much on those. All right, now those are ready to be hit with the torque wrench. Okay, we're going ahead and setting our torque wrench to 80 foot-pounds. Spec calls for 80 to 85. All right, now that we've got all those torqued, I'm gonna go ahead and mark them off. So we're marking off each one that we've torqued just to really help ourselves track that everything has been torqued to spec. We want to avoid having anything forgotten about, so the more checks like that we can have, the less likely it is for things to be missed. Okay, now we're gonna go ahead and grab our rod assembly along with our spacer, 2 flat washers, and our bolt and top lock nut. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and loosely assemble our TracBar rod to our axle bracket. First we'll have our bolts. We're gonna have our flat washer, and you want the head of the bolt facing toward the rear of the coach. Otherwise, if you were facing forward, you'd be sticking out too much, and once our TracBar mounting bracket goes across the top, you may run into interference issues. Now, the fixed end of the TracBar rod, I'm gonna go ahead and put our bolt washer in. Remember to have your washer on the outside of the tire or the TracBar end. Gonna go ahead, so assemble it like so. I'll grab the nut and flat washer for the other side, and we're gonna go to that outer hole. So we'll hold that in place, come over to the other side, and again, we're just getting it started, just loosely assembling it, make sure it's gonna stay up there. Okay, in preparation for putting our TracBar bracket on the chassis side, we're gonna go ahead and remove our end link bolts. So these are 18 millimeter. Okay, now those we can really leave in place there. If the bar stays, that's better for us. Now we're gonna go ahead, put our chassis side TracBar bracket in place. So we've got the 2 eyelet sides to the rear, which is really the only way it can go because these holes have to be on the top. All right. Okay, now we'll go ahead and get the other side of our chassis bracket in place. Getting that end link lined up. Again, we're reusing our hardware. These 2 bolts previously came from our sway bar mounting. Go ahead and get the nuts started. In this case, the bolts do stick out a little bit farther than what the stock ones did, even with that added thickness of the bracket, but we're still clear of our spring pack, and it's never going to shift over enough for that to contact, especially with our new TracBar in place. That's going to further limit side movement of the axle. So we'll get both of those in place. Then we'll go ahead and snug those up. I'm gonna wait to cinch that very tight till I get this one closer to where it's gonna be. I want to make sure that that bar is sitting flush where it's supposed to there before I really snug it down too far. Again, I just use the wrench just to run those down snug, and then we'll go for the torque spec on that. Here you can see why this bolt on the axle side end of the TracBar has to face the way it does. Otherwise, you'd be right up against this bracket here. And also, this is why you need to assemble the TracBar to your axle bracket first, because with this bracket in place, you wouldn't have room to get all that in place. Now that we have our chassis side bracket in place, we're going to go ahead and torque it to spec, which in this case is 80 foot-pounds. Now we'll do the other side. Alright, now that we've got these torqued to spec, we're going to go ahead and mark them off. Now that we have our chassis side TracBar bracket in place, we're going to go ahead and get our TracBar adjusted to where it lines up with the eyelet in the chassis bracket. So you can see now we're not lined up. We're going to have to loosen that up a bit. Once we've done that, we'll grab our bolt. Okay, now that our TracBar has been adjusted to length, we're going to go ahead and put our bolt through. So in this case, it doesn't really matter which way it faces. The main thing is you want to make sure that your washer goes between the head of the bolt or nut and your TracBar. You don't want to have your fastener directly up against the TracBar. So I think in this case, I'm going to go ahead and run it from the front rearward. So we got our bolt, we've got our washer. Gonna go ahead and run that through. We do our other washer and our top lock nut, making sure your locking, your nylock is on the outside. All right, now that we've got our TracBar in place with both ends loosely connected, we're gonna go ahead and tighten both ends. So we've got our 1 1/8" socket here. Right now I've got a deep socket with an extension. It gets a little tricky clearing your end link here, but I should be able to get to it with this deep socket and the extension. Grab my wrench for the other side. And our torque spec for these is pretty high. I believe it's at least 150 foot-pounds, so I'm going to hammer this a little bit. Okay, now we're coming on over to the other side. For this side, due to clearance between the shock absorber and the back of the bolt, I'm just going to use my deep socket. I don't have an extension on it right now, and we'll see. This should give us good clearance. Our torque spec is 120 to 150 foot-pounds. We'll see if I can get away with this without having to hold it. Yep. All right, so I'm already there. Now we'll go ahead and do the other side. I end wrench on the front here because this side is wanting to spin. All right, now with both ends torqued down, as with all of our other fasteners, we're gonna go ahead and mark them. We have torqued them to spec. Okay, now our final step is just to tighten down our jam nut on the adjuster. So we'll go ahead and put some Loctite. This one does have a torque spec, but you would need to use a crow's foot extension along with your torque wrench to do it. And really it's just to keep the rod from moving around, from working its way loose. So we're just gonna do this one really tight. All right, with that, our jam nut is now torqued. We'll go ahead and mark that off as well. And that completes the installation of our SS701 rear track bar on a 2021 Mercedes Sprinter 3500. As always, we wish you safer and happier driving. Have a great day.